There are vested interests that don't want you to put this stuff out into the world, and they will try and convince you not to do so. And so it's that balance of doubting yourself and doubting that being a healthy thing because you need to get it right, with being able to actually then go, no, like, I'm actually confident I've got it right, and we're going to publish. Our lifestyles in terms of climate change are, basically at the cost of other people's lifestyles on like the other side of the planet. And so it's no longer like, I'm like, what I'm doing or what the government is doing or companies are doing is like affecting these like anonymous people. I like think of my friend. I basically think like storytelling is one of the most powerful tools we have to bring about change. And I love stories. I love writing stories. I love meeting people, providing different perspectives. And it's a tool to like hold the powerful to account.
You start in The Guardian, you put on a desk looking at climate change, not necessarily wanting to focus that on initially, but you've since dedicated your career to that at Unearthed and also at The Guardian previously, and Greenpeace now. So, I mean, for you, you see this big issue. How do you approach it? So you're a writer, but like, how do you approach, like, what are your methods and your tactics for addressing this huge problem of climate change?
Well, I'd say it's not just climate change. There's lots of other environmental issues.
Okay.
In fact, I think like the issue of how we kind of environmental destruction, so like deforestation, what we're doing to the oceans, the number of, so there's like 1 million species are heading for extinction. And like
1 million?
Yeah, and the impact that's going to have on like our lives because, insects pollinate our food.
Yeah. Well, the bees, right? If the bees go, then...
Well, it's not just the bees, like the worms, like all the creatures in the soil keep the soil healthy so that we can produce food. If that stops happening, like, I don't know. I once asked a scientist that question, like, what if that stops happening? And they just like looked. They just didn't know what to say. They just had no words. But anyway, I just wanted to make that point because
it's a really important
so often
point.
it kind of gets climate change gets all the kind of focus.
Excuse me.
How do I approach it? Well, our role as journalists is to put information into the public sphere. Okay. And so I basically see our role as the basis upon which everything else can happen.
That's a big statement. Why is that?
It is a big statement, but if like, how do you campaign on an issue? How does a politician do anything about an issue? How does a company address an issue if it doesn't understand the issue, if it doesn't have the right information? How do you know how to make a difference in your life if you, it's all based on the information that you have available to you?
But it takes me back to a lot of conversations I had when I was sort of starting my career as a community organizer, and also campaigning for human rights in the Philippines. As a campaigner, our job was to raise awareness in the UK about the extrajudicial killings in the Philippines. That was our whole thing. And if we raise enough awareness, people will do something about it. But in fact, it wasn't that simple. People knew about it, but they couldn't. They felt like they couldn't do anything about it. So I think there's the bit there about what comes next, and maybe I'm curious to see how you write or how you think about the content you put out there as a means through which to inform, but also then allow people to act. Because actually, last summer, seeing a headline in the newspapers of, there being a 300% increase in hate crime towards East and Southeast Asian people in the UK, being attacked for supposedly causing the coronavirus and being attacked simply because of the colour of our skin, all being kind of put together as this group who are so diverse and different. But that figure, threefold increase, that kind of spurred myself and so many other people to be like, what's going on? That can't be happening. We've got to do something about it. We've got to stop this before it increases even more. So the power of a headline actually is really big. I mean, for you as somebody who's written so many headlines and done so much investigative work, how have you seen this starting point or the pieces you write and the words you write leading to some people acting. Do you have examples of that?
Yeah.
Loads, huh?
Hey?
Lots.
It varies a lot. So I think your point about, you put stuff out in the world and so you hope that people will act. But I think for us in particular, particularly doing like investigative stuff and journalism, it's about holding specific people to account. So it's not, it's also about like giving, anybody who wants to the tools to act on something, but it's also about holding the feet of a company to the fire. It's about requiring them to act, putting pressure on them. I've now forgotten your other question.
Well, I guess it's the general sense of like, have you
what impact
personal
stories?
experience of like a story you've written. I mean, there's a lot of people out there, some of whom might be listening, who are thinking, if I do write something or if I do become a journalist, I'd love to know how my words could really spur on a change.
Yeah, for sure. So I wrote a piece last summer. It's probably the biggest story I've written, maybe, Unearthed anyway.
Wow.
It was on the front page of the New York Times, which was very nice.
Amazing.
It was basically a story about how I got hold of documents showing that oil and chemical companies, through trade associations, have been lobbying to use a Kenya-US trade deal to expand plastics across Africa. So that's both plastic waste and the plastic industry. Africa is not, there's already like too much plastic waste being sent to countries in the global south. Like there's not the room to send any more. And
wait. So for people who are not as deeply engaged, there is a deal going on where Western-based companies are sending pollution or sending.
Okay, I'll roll back. So our waste in this country and in many Western countries, a lot of it gets sent abroad.
Okay.
So it will be sent to other countries. In recent years, originally a lot was going to China. China took
and they're getting paid
like more than half of the UK, the US's waste.
So this is news to me. So why are they getting paid to take the waste?
Yes, there's like a subsidy scheme which is really complicated. I wouldn't be able to explain it now, but companies over there might take it. They might be able to make some money off the stuff that is recyclable, but then what happens to the rest of it?
What does
well, that's the question. We know, for example, 2-3 years ago, my colleague, we wanted to prove basically that UK waste was ending up in countries on the other side of the world, and that the government, it's illegal to export waste, so it's only legal to export it for recycling. So we wanted to prove that where it was ending up, it wasn't actually being recycled. Yeah. And so my colleague went across to Malaysia, and lucky her, got to wade through lots of waste dumps and found loads of British waste, basically. Found some bags from UK councils, found lots of brands from UK supermarkets.
In Malaysia? Where is this? Like, I mean, is it on a beach? Is it in like a waste field?
It's in like big like waste dumps, like 6-8 foot high.
In the middle of the countryside or in cities?
I think, like maybe on like the outskirts of cities. I'm not sure exactly. But also like, it will seep into rivers, which is how it gets into the ocean.
Yeah.
I've lost my train of thought.
No, I mean, like this is, for me, as you say, when it comes to matters related to the environment, there's so many different parts to it. Climate change is the thing, as you say, which is sort of mainly gets the headlines or what people think about. And I guess there have been like examples of retail and restaurants being impacted around plastic straws and the use of plastic bags in supermarkets and so forth. But this bit about sending waste, I mean, that's a huge thing which many people, I'm sure, aren't aware of, including myself. I mean, I was surprised at the fact that you're actually like, we're exporting waste to different countries.
Yeah, loads, and we still do it,
So, and for me, again, this is a live example of the power of information to sort of make you think, oh, damn, like, something needs to be done about that. I mean, so your colleagues in Malaysia, you want to prove that this effectively is not legal because you're saying that you cannot export waste. You can only export things which could be recycled. Your colleagues saw with her own hands and her eyes that actually it wasn't being recycled. Yeah. So then what happened next?
Well, I'm now talking about a story that's not mine. So
I'll
have to pivot to one that perhaps is mine, where I know a bit more. But I'll give you an example, like talking about the story, power of storytelling. So like my colleague brought back some bits of that waste. And one day my boss turned up at my desk holding like, I think it was like a magazine cover or something, like really old, grimy. And I thought, I know what you want me to do. You want me to go and find who this piece of waste belongs to. And so I travelled up to Yorkshire to find the owner of this piece of waste, this recyclable waste, which she had presumably thrown away, put in her recycling, however many months before. It had been to the other side of the world, ended up in a legal waste dump, and now I was coming back to return it to her. And her face was quite something. But that's what I mean about the power of storytelling. Yeah. Like, that really, gets across the issue in a way that statistics kind of just wouldn't.
For sure.
But to return to, like, impact, so, there's this big problem where we're exporting a lot of our waste. The plastic waste is a particular problem. Yeah. And oil and chemical companies are basically lobbying to keep this happening. And they lobbied to use a deal between the US and Kenya to export more stuff to Africa, more like new plastic, but also more plastic waste. And they're doing this behind the scenes. So this information is not, well, sometimes it is technically public, like you could find it on the internet, but it's not being promoted, so the public doesn't know it. And sometimes it is in emails to officials, and we'll perhaps put in like a freedom of information request to get this information out. So that's a lot of our job is about like revealing to the public what goes on behind closed doors. Okay. And so off the back of that story, there ended up being 62 members of Congress wrote to Trump and asked him to basically stop the deal, or to stop to not use the deal.
Because they read your piece? Yeah. In front of New York Times?
Well, presumably they read it on the New York Times. So the way we work is that we partner with the New York Times. So it wasn't my words in the New York Times. They wrote their own story based on what we'd found. Sure.
So you did investigative work. They put it in front of millions of people, including powerful politicians. Yeah. And 60 plus of them wrote to Trump.
Yeah. And then also in Kenya, the Trade Secretary made a statement about it. The Environment Minister made a statement about it, saying that they wouldn't tolerate this from companies. And there were even like little protests by young people. So it's quite amazing, really. It was amazing for me, because I'd never seen that with a story that I'd written, to see. I found some documents on the internet, wrote some words about them, told some people, and then like kids on the other side of the world are protesting. Wow. Like, it just blew my mind, really.
It is mind-blowing.
But that's an example of like the problem with sort of impact in journalism is a lot of the time you don't know. There's no way of knowing because these decisions go on behind closed doors. And with this example, a deal was being struck, which it's still being concluded, may not even happen, in which there's reason to believe that this is on the table, that using the deal in this way is on the table. And perhaps as a result of the story, we don't know, but perhaps that won't no longer be on the table. Yeah. Like, that won't happen. But we will never know, because if that happens, something that may have happened has not happened. But it's like a negative, if you see what I mean. There's no way of knowing. But so I can say, look, these powerful people saw the story and made a statement about it. Did it prevent the thing from happening? I don't know.
Yeah. No, it's a great example of sort of sometimes when you act, you really don't know who's being impacted until randomly 2 years later someone says, oh, by the way, I saw what you said in that speech, or by the way, I read that sentence you wrote or paragraph you wrote in your story, and that changed. You know, sometimes people say it's changed their lives, and you know, there's that joke about how every single person there's a selfie or a photo of you in someone's phone because they've taken a screenshot of it, and no one knows, because the whole point is that you're out there in the world doing something, and sometimes who you are, your identity is kind of part of someone else, because they might have like been impacted you in ways which you'd never know. And for an organization, I mean, that's for an individual, but for an organization who's doing investigative work constantly, as you say, sometimes things go on silently, which you'll never know as a response to some of the work that you've done. Last time we spoke, we was in Sassoni's restaurant. Before that, we had a little walk in Walthamstow Marshes. What are you up to now? Because I know that obviously you're really focused on investigative journalism and all that kind of work, but it'd be great to know a little bit about yourself and kind of what you're up to.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I've been working for the last 5 years for a journalistic project called Unearthed, which is does investigative environmental journalism. We're based at Greenpeace, but we're editorially independent. So we investigate mostly like the roles of governments and companies in perpetuating the climate crisis, or in terms of the crisis to do with plastic or biodiversity. So I've been doing that for 5 years, and before that I was working for The Guardian for most of 3 years. Spent quite a lot on the environment desk, particularly involved with a climate change campaign called Keep It in the Ground, which was in the run-up to the Paris deal, which you might remember in 2015, the sort of most recent like landmark climate change deal.
Yeah, you've been on this for quite some time, and I think, you know, given the fact that we're having negotiations now coming up on climate in I think it's London,
November,
but also in
Glasgow.
Glasgow, yeah. I mean, for you, obviously climate change is such a big thing that you're concerned about, as well as the impact of us humans on the environment. I mean, how did you sort of start your journey there? What was it about the kind of problems that we were causing around climate change that made you think, I want to do something? Do you remember a moment where you're like, actually, I want to do something?
Yeah, I think I was. I read a book about it when I was about 18. I think it was just like a general guide to climate change or something. And I was just really shocked, I think. And the main shock was that, like, I kind of realized that the adults didn't have things under control. And felt really, alarmed. So I guess that was kind of like a pin dropping moment. And I volunteered on various things, kind of environmental, climate related. But it actually wasn't until I got to The Guardian that I started doing work on it. And I hadn't planned to do work on it, actually, because I thought it was too science driven and technology driven, and so not suited to me. And so I was actually appointed to work on the environment desk. I didn't actually choose it.
Oh, interesting. I want to go back to that book though. So, I mean, the power of a book and words, you know, question whether or not writing a book nowadays, in the age of TikTok, in the age of fast consumption, video content, 30 seconds, 10 seconds, 1 minute, too long. For you, that book, I mean, like, what was it about it? I mean, you mentioned the statistics. Was it about the facts, the reality? I mean, you were 18, reading something, and sometimes people might even go the opposite way, where they read something and it brings them on a whole different place. What was it about this book that really kind of drove you? Because there's a lot of people who are interested in things, they might read it, but they don't necessarily want to do something about it once they've read what the problems are.
Yeah, actually thinking about it, I mean, it was a very like facts-based book. It wasn't really like a polemic or anything.
Okay.
So I guess just learning the facts, which I felt, you know, you touched on them at school, but you hadn't really done very much on them. And I felt alarmed that we hadn't, I guess I felt like I hadn't really been told the truth.
Oh, really? So like curtains pulled open and sort of...
Yeah. And then I think I got the fire in the belly more. I went travelling around Africa for several months.
Whereabouts?
And that wasn't spent a lot of time in like East Africa, and then travelled down, ended up in South Africa.
Okay.
So I went through quite a lot of countries. But I guess like meeting people and making friends and just seeing like how different people's lives were from mine, but also how like we had a connection. Like we, you know, like we get told so much about Africa, and like the images we have of poverty and war, and like just kind of building a human connection with people made me really angry, I guess. And so the combination of those two things when I got back, made me want to act on like a lot of different issues.
That's fascinating. So you've gone from like what you were reading to then a real experience where you were experiencing difference, but also similarities, and sort of, it seems like this bit about discovery is quite important to you, where, you know, the world is depicted in a certain way, but then you see the reality in, you know, the difference between what we're told about something and the actual what's really happening. I mean, do you remember a particular example of a person or a conversation you had when you were on your travels which sort of sparked you? Because I think like for a lot of people, particularly those who've never been able to travel around the country, let alone, to another country or region, particularly our young folk, you know, who've had to experience the travel restrictions of the coronavirus and pandemic, there is something about travel, right, that can open up your mind, because so much of what we think about strangers or other places is defined by, you know, something that's written from a person's perspective, which isn't necessarily ours. So, yeah, was there a moment, do you remember, like on your travels where you're like, okay, I mean, because not everybody goes traveling and thinks, okay, I want to dedicate what you've done, dedicate your career to tackling social injustice?
I'm struggling to think of like a moment on that trip, but I actually went back I went to West Africa, to Benin for a work trip several years later, and made really good friends with a woman called Roblania, who worked at the organisation that we were partnering with. It was a microfinance project. And she just like let me into her home. Like I literally slept in her bed with her. I just met her, and we just like bonded really quickly. And she took me around on her motorbike like everywhere. She was such a character. She is such a character. So I made a real friendship. And then the weekend she took me home to her family, who lived in another city like a couple of hours away. Okay. And she didn't have any parents, and she was only like my age. She was like 23. Wow. And her parents had both died, and she had to work in the city in the week and look after her younger brothers and sisters, like at the weekend, who were in a different place, and like that was her whole life. Wow. And you know, she didn't have the kind of like welfare state support that we would have in this country. And so I think, I guess now when I like work on stuff where I think, right, okay, like our lifestyles in terms of climate change are, you know, basically at the cost of other people's lifestyles on like the other side of the planet. And so it's no longer like, I'm like, what I'm doing or what the government is doing or companies are doing is like affecting these like anonymous people. I like think of my friend, and and I think so I think that's kind of a good example, maybe.
No, that's a great story, because I think sometimes with an issue as big and sort of abstract as, well, for some abstract, you know, climate change, you almost wonder what part can I play in addressing this, or what impact is this really having? And so to root it in sort of the people who are being impacted around the world, as a push to kind of do what you do, like that's really fascinating. And I guess to fast forward to then your first experience at The Guardian, so you sort of, you know, you had this general sense you wanted to do something, and then you were put on a desk where you were looking at climate change. I mean, what was that experience like? And kind of why did you decide to become a journalist as well?
I think I decided to become a journalist for a couple of reasons. One, which are kind of the same reason. I basically think like storytelling is one of the most powerful tools we have to bring about change. And I love stories. I love writing stories. I love meeting people, providing different perspectives, and it's a tool to like hold the powerful to account, basically. I've forgotten your first question. What was the question?
And so what was the experience on your first time when you were like, on a desk,
Oh,
starting your career as a journalist and kind
Yeah.
of being put on this
like,
focus on
terrifying.
Oh, for real? Terrifying. How so?
Because I initially did their trainee program, but most
Okay.
people on it had
What was the
had
training
done like
program?
it was The Guardian ran like a digital trainee program
Okay.
to bring in kind of a new generation of journalists. And most of the people on the program had done like a training, had done like a master's or some sort of journalism qualification. But I didn't, and so I just felt like I was just thrown in the deep end. I didn't know what I was doing. And your work is so public, you know, it's got your name on it, which is
Yeah.
kind of important in a way because it means that you're accountable for it.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the fear of messing up was high. The imposter
Okay.
syndrome was high.
I mean, that's the thing. Like, so many people, we don't do things because we don't think we're good enough, right? There's this thing where we might have a vision of where we want to get to, right? We've got these big dreams, but you've got a lot of people sort of questioning that, you know, that's not possible. You can't do this. You can't do that. This is for other people. And I guess you had that when you were kind of amidst all of these other talented young people with, you know, all of the glitzy titles and MSCs and all that kind of stuff. And then you were there sort of with the same ambition. I mean, how did you, did you, you know, how did you get the roles afterwards? Was it about like hard work? What differentiated you? Like?
Well, I think people had like a varying degrees of like qualifications and stuff. As in what got me the job? Do I think?
Yeah.
I think, I mean, I think it's a combination of hard work, luck, and also being like white middle class.
Okay.
Obviously
What do you
helps.
mean?
Well, I think that I just like there would be a lot more barriers for me if I wasn't white and middle class. Like, I mean, Uprising helped me loads. I didn't have any contacts in the industry, but you know, like I know other people who are in quite sort of public or high flying roles who I could call on for advice. So yeah, I think the combination of those three things, and also like pitching some ideas. I was quite surprised at the interview because I didn't have the kind of qualifications, and so I pitched a bunch of ideas, and I think probably that is what got them interested. So yeah.
Cool. So taking initiative, sort of, as you say, the luck bit, your background. I mean, I'd love to kind of touch upon where you've gone since, and I think that will be the bulk of our conversation next. But I'm really curious, like this bit about professions and some of the barriers, and we've talked about this at length, given our joint experience at Uprising. You know, the lack of diversity in leadership positions, the availability, of early stage diversity programs, whether that be about getting more women into industry, getting more ethnic minorities into industry, getting more working class folk in industry, but a bit about that piece of the ladder where, you know, we're talking about C-level, director level folk. I mean, I'm curious to tease a bit about that. Like, have you personally kind of seen ways in which people try to address that in the world of the media? You know, the lack of social mobility or work mobility within media.
Yeah, there are schemes like the Guardian has like a work experience scheme, and I think a more longer term scheme. It has like a bursaries it offers for like a year where it'll pay for your training opportunities. We at Unearthed are like implementing a plan at the moment.
Okay, what's that plan?
Well, yeah, it's about recruitment, but it's also about like who we quote in our stories, the kind of stories we write about. So, you know, this is not like environmental issues are not just about whales and polar bears. Like those things are important, but you know, it's about like where are we sending our waste to? It's about like where do we put polluting industries? Which communities do they go next to? It's about like how much power do countries in the global south have at UN conferences.
That bit about who we quote is quite interesting though, because your bit about the beginning of the story around a book having such a powerful part to play in your life and the power of stories. I guess there's a question there in the media of who tells those stories and who are the characters in those stories. So as a journalist, as a writer, as somebody who's investigating what's happening out there in the world, how do we actually ensure that the voices that are heard are diverse and recognised and not the same old voices?
I think you keep a track of it. So
Okay.
I started doing this a few years ago when I read an article by a journalist called Ed Yong.
Okay.
He works for, I think it's The Atlantic. He does science stuff. He did a lot on the pandemic. But he did an article. He was sort of ahead of his time on this, really, where he started tracking who he quoted in his stories. I think he did it with
Like
women.
an Excel
first.
spreadsheet?
In a spreadsheet, yeah, the
Wow.
men and women. Yeah, I think he did it on gender, and then he wrote an article about like what he'd learned, and how much he'd improved, etc. And so I thought, right, I'm going to do the same thing.
Yeah.
And I was shocked. Like I was like,
What?
okay, when you see the numbers there in black and white, you're like, okay, yeah, I've got a problem.
What was the problem? What did you see on the spreadsheet?
Oh, I can't remember what the numbers are, but
So you brought your laptop out. You
well, I
put
went
in
through
data
all
and
of my
saw-
stories
Yeah.
for like 2 years and
Yeah.
pulled out everybody that I quoted, and then
Oh,
noted,
retrospectively.
yeah, and then
Okay.
noted like, are they a man, are they a woman, are they white,
Yeah.
are they a person of color,
Yeah.
and
what was
then added up. I can't remember the numbers, but for women it was significantly below 50%. For people of color it was really small.
Wow.
And so I've got better since then.
Good.
Yeah.
No, that's amazing.
Um,
I mean, but for me, the reason why that's amazing is because it was almost like, here's a writer somewhere in the Atlantic thinking, okay, let me just have a little bit of an experiment. I'm going to try something different. Just check the data as an individual, writer, and then told a story about it. And then now you're doing it, and you're seeing right in front of you in your laptop on your piece of paper, like the data just screaming, and it's actually made a difference to the way you do things. I mean, is that something which you think a lot of the industry are now doing?
I don't know, actually. It's a good question. We've committed to, so we're all doing it now, and we're going to publish them like every 6 months.
Publicly?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
So, but I don't know if I've seen actually any other organisation that's made a public statement on it. I wouldn't be surprised if there were, but I'm not aware of it.
I mean, in the same way we ask, financial institutions, big companies for transparency, I think this is a great example of not only media institutions or organisations, but individual people who are collecting stories like yourself to keep accountable. I mean, you mentioned it before, your name is there, you're accountable for stories you write. And actually the methods of which you write your stories is very important as well. So I think that's a great example of, in a way, the how-tos of making media or addressing some of the kind of lack of diversity within an industry. And I think a load of industries can learn from that. I mean, for you as a journalist, so you've done obviously training, you've done the bit with The Guardian early on, but also you've learned so much over your career. One of the examples you've just given about how you've used all your knowledge, skills and networks to create a story which has had real world impact. Can you literally share with us how you approach it step by step? So in your head, you're like, okay, I go to the office, you're starting brand new, you don't necessarily have a story straight away. What is the step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or however many steps, it could be 2 steps, of you thinking, this is what I'm going to do today, this is how I'm going to put it.
So in terms of like how I would approach trying to find a story, it's about creating a theory.
Okay.
So with the story about plastics being sent to Africa, there was a UN convention which manages hazardous waste and how it gets transported around the world. And basically this convention was changing its rules to incorporate plastic for the first time, and specifically with the idea of trying to tighten up, put restrictions on plastic waste being sent to countries in the global south that don't have the infrastructure necessarily to deal with it. And I was aware that the US I'd read in news stories that the US had argued against, at the negotiations, had argued against these new restrictions coming in, and they were the only country that were not happy with them. And so that prompted the question in my mind, why were they under pressure to were they under pressure to try and stop these new rules coming in? Why would they be under pressure? Well, who's got a vested interest in preventing these rules coming in? Companies who would be making plastic. And so I did a lot of research. I spoke to contacts and said, who was at these UN conventions? What industry representation was there? Which are the big companies in this industry? Who are the trade associations that represent them? Who are the individuals who work for these trade associations who might be in contact with the individuals at the Environmental Protection Agency? Which are the individuals at the Environmental Protection Agency that work on this stuff? And then I submitted an FOI request, Freedom of Information request. That's where you can ask the government for information that you believe they hold. And there are lots of rules around, like, do they have to release it or not? But often you can get stuff out of them. So I put in a request for all correspondence between the individuals at the trade associations and the individuals at the Environmental Protection Office. And I got about 200 pages worth of stuff. It took about a year and a half to get it. But
from request to
yeah.
receipt. And was that a lot of sort of toing and froing?
Not really. In the US, it's pretty straightforward. Sometimes they take absolutely ages, but they'll often give you what you've asked for, whereas in the UK, it can be much quicker, but it's much harder to get stuff.
Got it. So you've got these 200 pages worth of information. What next?
So next, trying to understand what's in these documents, analysing them and being like, is this information that is already in the public domain? Do we know this stuff already, or is this new? Is this stuff in the public interest? So, asking questions like, is the company saying something? Is the company or the trade association saying something which contradicts what they say in public? That would be one thing to look for. Are they trying to influence negotiations in a way that isn't already public? So trying to find new information, basically. Then speaking to a lot of experts to make sure you understand what they're saying correctly. Getting quotes from them, for that story, speaking to people in Kenya to work out, how big an issue is plastic waste in Kenya? How does it impact people on the ground? Do you think this is relevant? Then sort of writing up a story, and then approaching the companies, the trade associations that you're writing about, and the government, and saying, this is the information we've got. Do you think it's inaccurate in any way? Do you want to comment on it? And then if it's, you would incorporate their statements, and then you would publish it. But that's the most stressful stage of the process.
Which part?
Going to basically, we're normally holding a company or a government to account. So going to that company, or going to the people who've got the power, and saying, we're going to say this thing about you. You know that they're not going to like it, and waiting for their response. So.
Go on.
Yeah, you would give them a few days to respond.
And why is that stressful?
Because it's confrontation, basically. That they will try a number of ways, many different ways, to try and convince you that either your information is wrong or that you've taken it out of context.
And do you have an example? Did they do that to you?
I can't remember specifically that story, but a common thing that a company or a government will do would be to say that it is just completely inaccurate. So you would go to them with we're going to say these 10 specific things, and they won't address the 10 specific points necessarily. They'll just come back and say the whole thing is inaccurate.
And so you have to quote that? Or you say
it depends. So we would basically always quote something of what they said, but sometimes they'll send back 3 pages. You can publish that, but you're not going to put all of that in the story. Sometimes they do send stuff back, and it makes you think that you need to go through new checks and check that you've got it right. And occasionally you have got it wrong, but most of the time they're trying to influence you. They're trying to make you doubt yourself.
Doubt yourself?
Yeah, or occasionally we'll get legal letters, or they'll use language that is patronising, or even occasionally a bit intimidating.
Patronising, intimidating, stressful. It feels like I can feel like you're breathing more heavily as well. Look, the reality is you are one person within an organisation that's fighting for social justice, and in this case environmental justice, and you are taking on as you say, these big, powerful organizations. Myself, as somebody who is the representative claimant of a class action against Facebook, one of the biggest, most powerful companies in the world, if not history, there's elements there of fear because you are going up against such powerful forces. But at the same time, if not you, if not someone, and there's a bit about courage there. So, despite your reaction, which I can see, and I've seen so many times because this work is hard, and deserves courage, like what pushes you to continue and what pushes you to do it?
I guess like anger, it's quite a driver. And needing to feel like I have some agency. So, all of these, the state of the world that we're in and the prospect of the world we're going to be in like 20, 30 years time is really scary. And for me, being able to do something in a really small way is, gives me some agency. It's actually like a coping mechanism. But you've got to balance that.
Coping mechanism in what sense? Sort of, there's this world coming to us and there's so much happening and we're like, can you play a small part? Is that what it is?
Yeah, it makes me feel like I have some power in the situation. That's some part of it. I can control, I can do something, in however many, 2-3 decades time, I can go like, I did what I could. And it's, I guess it's that idea of being disempowered. Like, I feel I have some small slither of power. And you're representing other people. You're representing the public. That's my job. I'm asking questions on behalf of the public.
So in writing a story, first off, it really starts off with asking questions, sparked off by some inspiration you might have had from reading some newspapers or a story or what someone might have said, and then you sort of literally investigate through asking more questions and coming up with a hypothesis about what's going on and is there information that the public need to know. For me, what was fascinating about the way you described your process is that the writing is such a small part of this whole process. And actually, it's about the negotiations, it's about the partnerships, it's about the networks you have and the information gathering piece. And so it's a fascinating way of describing. So I feel like there's a lot of people who are listening who I think can glean the importance of your type of work, particularly with the media industry, and which is losing a lot of funding. And I think there's a lot of questions there about how we as the public and citizens can help fund and back organizations like yours who are doing critical work which couldn't be done without a proper investigative, trained, skilled team of people like yourself. So I really appreciate you sharing that story. And I kind of want to end on the bit about holding power to account. So there are many ways in which we can hold power to account, and power for people, somebody is completely different to another person. In your role as an investigative journalist, as a writer, as a thinker, as somebody who asks questions on behalf of the public, kind of what advice would you give to people out there who are seeking to use the power of the written word as well as journalism to try and bring more social justice to the world? What kind of advice and tips would you give them?
Probably two things. One would be get your facts right.
Okay.
That's the core job. That is like the basis of the job, is that you've got to be accurate. You lose all your credibility if you're not. You're not very useful. If you're not useful at all, if you're putting wrong information out there. And what I've learned as a journalist is that sometimes you do get it wrong. And it really challenges me to think about, when I'm chatting with my friends and the things that I say, like how the way your brain processes information and how accurate your own memory is. Working as a journalist has made me realize less accurate than I thought. You really need to triple check your own instincts. So the first thing would be get your facts right, and then after that, trust your instincts.
Doesn't triple check your instincts? How do you do that?
Not triple check your instincts. Triple check your facts.
Your facts. Okay. Just
yeah.
check.
So don't assume that your memory is correct. go back to the document and check.
Okay. Yeah.
Or check it with somebody else. You know, you shouldn't ever have just one person looking at a story. And second, you know, once you've got your facts straight, then trust your instincts. So that's like the constant battle with my job is doubt. Like, particularly with companies, historically, you know, the tobacco industry, the oil industry, one of their main tactics is they won't come out and put their position on the table and say, well, you know, we don't think we should act on climate change because we're making lots of money off this. They will just try to sow doubt that your facts are wrong. So they don't have to prove that, you know, the science is wrong. They just have to sow enough doubt in people's minds to think that it might be. So we can't make decisions on this basis. And so, yeah, there's a line about a story, a story is something that somebody else somewhere doesn't want you to publish. So
say that again.
A story is something that somebody else somewhere doesn't want you to publish. So there are vested interests that don't want you to put this stuff out into the world, and they will try and convince you not to do so. And so it's that balance of doubting yourself and doubting that being a healthy thing because you need to get it right, with being able to actually then go, no, like, I'm actually confident I've got it right, and we're going to publish.
Amazing. I wish we could go on. We can't, because I want to be respectful of your time. We've already gone over 15 minutes. Emma, I just want to say a huge thank you. As I said, we've been friends for a very long time, not necessarily 2008, but since 2012. It feels longer. I just want to end this by saying thank you, not only for being a good friend and being somebody I've spoken to about a whole range of things throughout the years, but also somebody who, from what I've discovered today, because we don't usually talk about work, but someone today who's really shown, I say the word, courage to take on these big giants through your written work, through your investigative journalism, through your raising questions, tough questions, and holding their feet to the fire through your work and your organisation's work, and I really appreciate that, and I'm sure many of the listeners and viewers will appreciate that too. So thank you for inspiring us. I'm sure there'll be people out there who want to be future Emmas. Yeah, look forward to seeing you in a future time, because I think we should continue this conversation.
Ace, thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you so much to all of you who have become monthly supporters of the School of Social Justice. Your monthly contributions make a huge difference and allow us to deliver content which is educational and teaches people how to make a difference. If you want to become a patron as well, it's really simple. All you've got to do is go to the schoolofsocialjustice.com website, then click supporters, and choose how much you want to contribute, whether it be £20 a month, a £5 a month, or a £10 a month. Let's go with a £10 a month. It's really simple. Put in your details, put in your card number, click pay now, and you become a supporter. Whilst £5 a month is not much individually, it makes a huge difference collectively. And if we get 2,000 patrons, we can independently deliver content to you every single week to help ensure that we fulfill this mission of training the next generation of Martin Luther Kings. Thank you so much to all of you who've become patrons so far. You've made a huge difference and allowed us to continue with our work. And if you do become a patron, thank you so much. Your support means a lot. Take care. Bye.